There was a world before chocolate felt ordinary, a world before cafe menus, dessert counters, holiday boxes, and the quiet comfort of a warm cup in the afternoon. A world before the smell of roasted cocoa could fill a kitchen and make people stop what they were doing for just a second. Most people today never think about how strange that is. Chocolate feels timeless, almost inevitable, as if human beings were always meant to have it. But it was not inevitable. It was made, it was discovered, cultivated, transformed, traded, argued over, taxed, sweetened, exported, and rewritten by history. And at the center of that story is Mexico, or more precisely, the wider Mesoamerican world that gave cacao its first meaning. The first thing to understand is that cacao was not invented by Europeans. It was not a European crop, not a European idea, not a European luxury waiting to be found. Long before the ships of Spain crossed the Atlantic, cacao trees were growing in the tropical regions of Mesoamerica, where people knew how to gather the pods, extract the beans, ferment them, dry them, roast them, grind them, and turn them into drinks that carried social, spiritual, and economic value. Cacao was part of a world that already had cities, markets, states, diplomacy, and deep culinary knowledge. It belonged to indigenous peoples who understood that bitterness could be precious, that a seed could be portable wealth, and that a drink could carry meaning far beyond taste. This matters because chocolate history is often told as if Europe woke up one day and invented refinement. That version is comforting, clean, and wrong. The truth is that the Americas, especially Mesoamerica, already had a cacao culture long before European contact. The exact forms varied across time and region. Different communities prepared cacao in different ways, with different ingredients and different purposes. Some drinks were consumed by elites, some were part of ceremonies, some were tied to trade, some were associated with tribute, some were consumed in contexts that marked rank, power, hospitality, or sacred obligation. But in every case, cacao was not just a flavor. It was a social fact. That is why the first chapter of this story should not be written in Europe at all. It should begin in landscapes where cacao trees could grow, in river valleys and humid lowlands connected to larger Mesoamerican networks. These were places of movement and exchange, not isolated villages sitting still in the past. Cacao traveled. It moved from growers to processors, from local systems into regional markets. Its value depended on human labor, and its meaning depended on human culture. A cacao bean was small enough to carry, but powerful enough to represent trust, rank, and exchange. If we imagine the world before colonialism, we should not imagine simplicity. We should imagine a dense web of relationships. Cacao sat inside that web. It was grown with knowledge of climate and soil. It was harvested with care. The pods were opened, and the beans were handled in ways that changed their flavor and usefulness. Fermentation mattered, drying mattered, roasting mattered, grinding mattered. In other words, what eventually became chocolate already depended on technical expertise. There was no raw miracle hiding in the tree. There was knowledge, and there was skill, and there were generations of people refining a process that outsiders would later pretend to own. To say cacao had value is not merely to say it was liked. Value in Mesoamerica could be political, symbolic, and material all at once. Cacao could circulate as a form of wealth. It could appear in tribute systems. It could support elite display. It could be part of celebrations and diplomatic exchange. It could be embedded in the economy of power. That is one reason the later European fascination with cacao was so intense. They were not encountering a simple plant, they were encountering something that had already been elevated by culture into an object of significance. And the drinks made from cacao were nothing like the candy bar image most people carry today. They were often bitter, they could be spiced, they could be foamy. They could be mixed with maize or chilies or other local ingredients depending on place and period. They were not designed to taste like dessert, they were designed to work inside a system of meaning. Their bitterness was not a defect that had to be corrected. Their complexity was part of their identity. To modern taste, they might seem surprising. To the people who prepared them, they were sophisticated. This is where the history becomes more than culinary. It becomes political. Because once a thing like cacao is part of ritual, trade, status, and social power, it can also become part of conquest. When empires arrive, they do not merely steal land, they also steal meanings, names, recipes, and credit. They take a local truth and turn it into a global commodity. That is exactly what happened to cacao after Europeans entered the Americas. But before that transformation became colonial fact, there was a moment of contact that is often misunderstood. In 1502, during Columbus's fourth voyage, Europeans encountered cacao beans for the first time in a documented way. That moment is important, but not because it was the birth of chocolate. It was not. Columbus did not invent chocolate. He did not carry chocolate directly into Europe as a finished delight. What he and his crew saw were cacao beans, and those beans revealed that the people they were meeting valued them highly. To the Europeans, the beans were strange, even puzzling. To the local people, they were part of an existing world. The mismatch between those two perspectives is one of the most revealing moments in the whole history of chocolate. Columbus's encounter in 1502 was an event of observation, not understanding. He saw a valuable object without knowing its full place in the society that used it. He saw exchange without grasping the larger economy. He saw a seed, but not the system around the seed. And that is often how empire begins, by seeing enough to desire, but not enough to respect. The Europeans were not yet ready to imagine chocolate as a global product. They were only beginning to realize that cacao mattered. The real story would unfold later, and it would unfold through Mexico. That later story belongs to New Spain, and New Spain belongs to Mexico's colonial transformation. Once the Spanish conquered large parts of the region, they inherited a cacao world they could not simply erase. They needed it. They wanted its value. They depended on indigenous labor, indigenous expertise, and indigenous agricultural systems even as they tried to dominate them. This is the hinge point where cacao became chocolate in a new global sense. Not because Europeans created it from nothing, but because they took an existing Mesoamerican substance and recast it inside colonial power. Mexico was central to that process because it was where the worlds collided most intensely. The Spanish built their colonial center in the former Aztec capital in the surrounding region. Tenochtitlan had been the heart of a vast political order, and after conquest, its aftermath became the heart of a new imperial system. That system did not erase the knowledge already present. It absorbed it, constrained it, profited from it, and repeatedly renamed it. Indigenous people continued to work, cook, grow, process, and trade under colonial pressure. The continuity matters. Without it, there would have been no cacao transformation to export. The story of Tenochtitlan is not just the story of a city falling, it is the story of a knowledge system being forced into a new political structure. Hernan Cortes and the conquistadors did not arrive in a blank land. They arrived in a densely organized world with its own foodways, trade routes, elites, markets, and ritual practices. Cacao existed inside that world before the conquest. And after the conquest, the same region became the engine through which cacao would be turned into a commodity for an empire that prized profit almost as much as power. One of the reasons this history gets distorted is that later writers like to center the dramatic European point of view. They tell the story as if Spanish men discovered chocolate in a flash of wonder. That makes for a tidy anecdote, but it hides the machinery. The real machinery was colonial. New Spain became a place where cacao could be gathered, taxed, processed, and transported through networks that connected inland production with Atlantic shipping. The product that left Mexico was not the same as the drink that had existed in Mesoamerican life, but it was also not a European invention. It was a colonial hybrid, and that hybrid had a Mexican base. If you want to understand why chocolate spread, you have to understand how colonial demand worked. The Spanish did not merely admire cacao, they learned how to use it in ways that fit their tastes and their social world. Sugar became central to that adaptation. Spices entered the mix. Preparation changed. The drink was made smoother for European palates in some settings, though not everywhere. And because sugar itself was becoming a global colonial product, the history of chocolate became entangled with the wider history of plantation economies, forced labor, and Atlantic trade. Chocolate did not travel alone, it traveled with empire. This is also why New Spain matters so much. It was not just a place of first contact, it was a place of translation. Cacao moved through indigenous hands into colonial systems that could then ship it outward. The Spanish court learned about cacao through the colonial world of Mexico and its surrounding regions. Merchants learned about it, clergy learned about it, physicians learned about it, wealthy households learned about it. And from there, chocolate began its slow rise as a prestige commodity in Europe. But the prestige was built on a story that Europe rarely told honestly. At first, chocolate was not mass culture, it was elite culture. Like many imported luxuries, it carried a sense of distance and exclusivity. That made it desirable. In Spain, it circulated among the powerful before it spread more widely. People debated whether it counted as food or drink, whether it broke fasting rules, whether it should be taken in the morning or at other times, whether it had medicinal properties, whether it was indulgent or restorative. These debates matter because they show that chocolate arrived as something unstable, not as a settled custom. It had to be interpreted, defended, condemned, and domesticated into European life. And the irony is that much of what Europeans found useful about chocolate came from the very fact that indigenous peoples had already given cacao a serious role in life. Europeans often imagined themselves as rational interpreters of exotic substances, but they were borrowing from a system they barely understood. They took the bean, the processing knowledge, and the symbolic prestige, then wrapped those things in their own language of medicine and luxury. The result was not a replacement of Mesoamerican cacao culture, but an appropriation layered on top of it. That appropriation was not neat. It relied on many kinds of people. Indigenous producers in Mexico and New Spain remained essential to cultivation and processing. Colonial intermediaries managed supply. Urban consumers shaped taste. Nuns, merchants, doctors, and aristocrats all played a role in deciding what chocolate meant. In that sense, the history of chocolate is not a straight line from one origin to one destination. It is a chain of transformations. Mexico sits at the center of that chain because it is where indigenous cacao knowledge met Spanish colonial ambition in a way that could be exported to the world. Some of the most fascinating parts of this story live in the everyday details. Imagine the labor of opening the pods, sorting the beans, fermenting them, drying them in the sun, roasting them carefully, grinding them on stone, and blending them into a drink. None of that is accidental. Each step reflects accumulated knowledge. When Europeans later praised chocolate, they were often praising a process they had not invented. The genius was not just in the bean, it was in the handling of the bean. And that handling was rooted in Mesoamerican practice. Even the sensory experience matters. Chocolate in its early forms was not merely sweet. It could be bitter, earthy, aromatic, and energizing. It could carry foam, which was often prized. It could be thick and serious. Those qualities help make it feel sophisticated in Mesoamerican settings, and they help make it feel exotic in Europe. But as Europe adjusted the drink to fit its own preferences, it also shifted the story. The sweetness that later people associate with chocolate was not the starting point, it was one of the later translations. The original logic was older, richer, and more culturally specific. Think about the symbolic shift. In Mesoamerica, cacao could communicate rank and sacred significance. In New Spain, it became a colonial resource. In Europe, it became a luxury and a debate. In the modern world, it became a mass consumer product. At each stage, the substance stayed recognizable, but the meaning changed. That is why chocolate history is a perfect example of how colonized knowledge gets remade. The original creators are often left in the background, while the later consumers get the credit. The more we look, the more Mexico emerges not as a footnote, but as the central corridor of change. Veracruz and other colonial routes connected cacao regions to ships. Mexico City became a node of administration and taste. New Spain's administrative structures helped regularize extraction and transport, and from there, cacao entered the Atlantic system. It is tempting to imagine chocolate as a European luxury with an American origin, but that sentence hides the most important part. The transformation happened in colonial Mexico before the rest of the world knew what to do with it. If you want a scene that captures the moral complexity, imagine a Spanish household in colonial Mexico or early Spain where the drink is prepared and served. The people consuming it may think they are enjoying something new, but the technique in their cup is carrying centuries of indigenous knowledge. The sugar may be Spanish, the setting may be European, but the core remains Mesoamerican. The fact that this exchange is so often sanitized says a lot about how history is told. We celebrate the product and forget the people. We remember the taste and erase the labor. Chocolate also reveals how empire likes to rename gifts after theft. Once the drink entered European culture, it began to acquire its own mythology. It could be framed as a discovery of civilized taste, a refinement of manners, a sign of cosmopolitan sophistication. But the language of discovery itself is misleading. Discovery implies that a thing was lying there waiting for the right person to notice it. Cacao was not waiting. It was already part of a living tradition. Europe did not discover chocolate so much as it encountered and repurposed a Mesoamerican inheritance. The longer chocolate circulated, the more it found new social uses. It could be a morning drink. It could be part of elite hospitality. It could appear in monasteries and medical settings. It could be discussed in terms of health and stimulation. It could be sold as fashionable restraint or indulgent pleasure, depending on who was arguing. The spread of chocolate through Europe was not just culinary, it was ideological. It reflected changes in class culture, colonial wealth, and the growing appetite for imported goods. Medical thinkers of the time were especially interested. In the humoral framework that shaped early modern medicine, foods and drinks were judged by their effects on the body. Chocolate could be praised for nourishing or strengthening, but it could also be criticized for excess. That tension is part of why it became such a status object. If a luxury is debated, it becomes more interesting. If it is imported from a distant colony, it becomes more exotic. If it is associated with health, it becomes easier to justify. Chocolate benefited from all three, and yet the deeper truth remained the same. Everything Europe loved about chocolate depended on what Mesoamerica and New Spain had already made possible. The bean was American, the processing knowledge was American. The colonial transformation was centered in Mexico. The export routes were imperial. The final European reputation was built on borrowed prestige. That is why it is not enough to say chocolate came from the Americas. We have to say more specifically that Mexico, in the broad Mesoamerican and colonial sense, was crucial to turning cacao into the global chocolate world. The role of indigenous women deserves special attention here, because much of the practical knowledge around cacao preparation and food culture was preserved and transmitted through daily labor often done by women. Colonial history has a habit of making that labor invisible. It praises the merchant, the governor, the bishop, the king. It does not always praise the person grinding the beans, mixing the drink, or preserving the recipe across generations. But that hidden labor is part of the story. Cultural continuity often survives through domestic skill, not public ceremony. Another reason the story feels modern is because it touches the same themes we still argue about today. Who gets credit for innovation? Who profits from cultural knowledge? What happens when a local food becomes a global commodity? How do empires absorb and rename the practices of the people they conquer? Chocolate is not just a sweet, it is a case study in globalization before the word existed. It teaches us that the movement of a product across oceans is never just a movement of flavor. It is a movement of power, and power always leaves a trace. The trace in chocolate is Mexico, not as a decorative background, but as the site where a pre existing indigenous cacao world was transformed under colonial rule into something that Europe could consume, classify, and sell. When people say chocolate changed the world, they often mean that it became beloved in Europe and later around the globe. That is true. But the more important question is how that change happened. It happened because Mesoamerican peoples had already made cacao culturally significant, because New Spain turned that significance into a colonial supply chain, and because Europe was eager to absorb the result without fully acknowledging the origin. If you zoom out, the story becomes even bigger. Cacao helps explain why the Atlantic world developed the way it did. It connects indigenous agriculture, Spanish conquest, African and indigenous labor systems, merchant networks, imperial tastes, and the creation of consumer habits that still shape daily life. Chocolate is one of those rare things that can look trivial while hiding enormous historical forces. A candy bar in the present is connected to markets, plantations, and political hierarchies of the past. A cup of hot chocolate can carry the memory of conquest and adaptation in a way most people never notice. The modern world loves to smooth over that kind of history. We tell ourselves that foods move naturally, that cultures share freely, that delicious things simply spread because they are good. But nothing about chocolate was natural in that simple sense. Its journey was made by human decisions under unequal conditions. It was carried by trade and conquest. It was interpreted by outsiders and preserved by insiders. It was transformed again and again until its original world became almost invisible behind its final form. Yet if we look closely, the old world is still there. You can still see it in the language of cacao. You can still see it in the colonial routes that made New Spain a vital bridge. You can still see it in the fact that the first European encounter in 1502 was not with chocolate bars, but with cacao beans already embedded in a living culture. You can still see it in the way chocolate became valuable because it was already valued somewhere else first. That is why the title of this story needs a careful correction. The world did not live without one of its greatest pleasures until Mexico invented chocolate in 1502. That would be false and it would erase too much. The better truth is more interesting. The world already knew cacao in Mesoamerica. Europeans first encountered the beans in 1502, and then Mexico, through New Spain, became the place where cacao was transformed into the colonial chocolate that would eventually sweep through Europe. The pleasure was not invented from nothing, it was inherited, altered, and exported. That inheritance still matters today. Every time chocolate is treated as a universal comfort food, there is an opportunity to remember that universality was built on specificity. The ingredient came from a particular place. The earliest expertise came from particular people. The colonial transformation happened in a particular region. History becomes richer, not poorer, when we say those things plainly. It gives the pleasure its depth back. Because chocolate tastes better, historically speaking, when you know what it cost, where it came from, and whose knowledge made it possible. It tastes better when you understand that it was once bitter, sacred, and deeply local before it became sweet, global, and familiar. It tastes better when you remember that a bean seen by Columbus in 1502 was not the beginning of the story, only the beginning of European contact with a story already centuries old. And maybe that is the real power of this history. Chocolate is a reminder that some of the things the world loves most are not inventions of the powerful. They are traditions the powerful later learn to consume. Cacao began in Mesoamerica. It was shaped by Mexican and broader indigenous knowledge. It passed through New Spain into the Atlantic world. Europe adopted it, renamed it, and profited from it. But the root never changed. So the next time chocolate melts on your tongue, remember that you are tasting more than sweetness. You are tasting a long chain of human labor, cultural memory, colonial extraction, and survival. You are tasting a history that began with Mesoamerican hands, passed through colonial Mexico, and became one of the world's most familiar pleasures. And if that sounds dramatic, it should. Because it is. The story of chocolate is not just the story of a food, it is the story of how the world learned to desire something that Mexico had already known for centuries.